Hello everybody, this is Nigel Dower here in Aberdeen in Scotland. I'm a retired philosopher. I used to teach at University of Aberdeen, but I've been interested in the ethics of development and world poverty and related issues for many years, since the 70s. And I'll let you read my bio that you can see on the first screen later in your own good time, but let me now move on to one particular work that I wrote at the end of the 70s. It came out in 1983. It was my first little book on world poverty, challenge and response. And this was really my attempt to start thinking philosophically about why I, as a rich northerner, was concerned about helping people in the South or in developing countries. I'd been doing this practically in an organization during the 70s called the World Development Movement. Anyway, so on and off I've been thinking about these issues for many years. And so I was very happy when I was asked by the Milton Foundation to provide 3 short lectures, presentations as it were, for you as you prepare for your week in Haiti. Anyway, as I said, there are 3 presentations, and the main purpose of this is to provide an ethical framework for thinking more deeply about, well, what aid is, why it's important, and if one engages in it, why one does it, and how one sees oneself doing it. So that's really what we're going to be doing in the 3 presentations. In the first presentation, I'm going to be talking about the ethical arguments for aid, why we should as individuals give aid, and why indeed countries should give aid. And then in the second presentation, I'm going to look at a number of arguments against aid and the replies that we can give to that. And finally, I'm going to broaden the discussion a little and talk about development ethics. Let me just first expand a little bit on these 3 themes for my 3 presentations. In the first presentation then, I'm going to look at the basic arguments for giving aid, but in addition to doing that, I need to make 1 or 2 distinctions. First, for instance, between emergency assistance and development assistance, how they're different, and then also the distinction between aid given by individuals and aid given by states. So that's what I'm going to look at in the next 20 minutes or so. And for that, I've suggested you read a very famous article by Peter Singer called Famine, Affluence and Morality. And I hope you've had a wee look at this before this presentation, but even if you haven't, it doesn't matter. You can read it afterwards, and that will perhaps help in your subsequent discussion and thinking about the issue. Then in the second presentation, which I'll be recording in a week or so's time, we'll be looking at the arguments, as I said, against aid and the various replies. There are lots of different kinds of objection to be considered. Many of these objections focus on the claim that in one way or another, aid doesn't work, either because the goals are not achieved or they're the wrong goals. And these are 2 quite different kinds of objection, of course. We need to look at those various arguments, particularly the arguments that say that aid doesn't work, because in considering the replies to those arguments that aid doesn't work, one gets a better idea of what the difference is between good aid and bad aid. And I think it is important to recognize that aid often doesn't work. It's not particularly successful, but we need to look at what makes good aid good aid. Anyway, that will lead naturally into our 3rd presentation topic, which is development ethics. And here I want to explore the whole idea of what is development anyway. Clearly, aid is contributing towards development, but if aid is good, then it must be good because it's achieving some change in a developing country. And so the question is, what makes that development good? Now, I expect you all think, well, isn't it obvious that development, as it's been understood, for instance, in the last 50 years, since the Second World War with the UN development decades and so on, you probably thought it pretty obvious that development is economic growth. Well, it does involve economic growth, and that I'll accept, but I think we'll see that actually development is a lot more complicated than economic growth, and that development is much more about enabling people, not just very poor people, but any person in a society to lead fuller and richer lives. And this idea, for instance, is expressed by one very well-known thinker about these matters, Amartya Sen, an Indian economist philosopher, who talks about development as the expansion of freedoms. Well, That's for the third presentation. I'm going to explore that wider framework because I think it helps us understand why aid is important and how aid fits into the total picture. Okay, so that's just an introduction to what I'm going to do in the next 3 sessions. Now let's turn to the ethical arguments for giving aid. As I said, the first main distinction, which was probably pretty obvious to you already, but it's worth spelling out, is the difference between emergency or humanitarian assistance, which is, of course, the immediate response to need for instance, food, clean water, or shelter caused by a disaster. And then, on the other hand, there's something we call development assistance, which is more a process of helping poor people on a longer-term basis to be less poor, in other words, to help them to help themselves. Now, this distinction is not always made, and they blur one into the other, of course, but I think we can all recognize that when there's an earthquake, as happened in Haiti, or whether there's a tsunami or a drought or whatever it might be, this creates an immediate emergency in the sense that people are immediately short of food or access to water or indeed shelter, and there is a response from both governments and private charities to try and rush in food and water and clothing and shelters and so on as appropriate, medical assistance and so on. And that's often gets the headlines. But of course, in many ways, what's more important in the long term is what we call development assistance, because a lot of the problems of poverty, a lot of the situations involving over 1 billion people in the world who are absolutely poor with not enough food, so they're starving or malnourished and so on and so forth. This poverty isn't just the product of emergencies. Most of such poverty is endemic. It's persistent. It's a part of the standing situation, as it were. And so development assistance is more a process of helping poor people, as it were, help themselves by providing, for instance, better access to clean water through wells, or helping them to improve their agricultural productivity, and so on and so forth. And so, in many ways, the various development agencies, private charities, as well as government aid departments, are as concerned with promoting development assistance in this sense, rather than just rushing in food and clothing and so on in emergencies. I expect you all know the Chinese proverb that runs something like this: give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, teach him to fish, and he can feed himself for a lifetime. Well, that's probably a little oversimplified and exaggerated, but I think we can all see the point there, that it's one thing to provide food, and many people have argued that food aid is actually on its own counterproductive. We'll look at that issue next time. But if you, as it were, enable him to acquire a skill, which he might not otherwise be able to get, then he can use that skill either directly to fish or to grow food, or to have a livelihood, which will then enable him to have money with which he can buy food. So I think we can all see the clear contrast there. And I suppose the question arises as to whether the ethical basis for giving both kinds of help is the same. Whether it's giving donations, that most of us do, who do it, or service, as some of us do some of the time, as you're doing for a week in Haiti. Is the basis the same, that we're simply trying to enable very poor people to escape some of the aspects of being extremely poor, or is it a different basis? Now, I would argue, and as the argument proceeds, it's basically the same basis. But the truth of the matter is that quite a lot of people will be much more interested in the one kind of assistance than the other kind of the assistance. That is, that they will find it perfectly natural to want to support emergency assistance because they're horrified by the idea of disasters and the consequences of disasters. But if you ask them, well, will you give money to enable poor people to do better for themselves in the longer term, their eyes will glaze over and they'll think, well, why shall I be so no concern with that. Conversely, other people may say, well, I'm much more interested in supporting long-term assistance because that's going to get you somewhere, whereas emergency assistance, well, it doesn't really solve any problems, does it? So you might like to think about that question. It's one of the questions I've asked at the end, because you may feel differently about the two kinds of case. I'm going to suggest that really, if we look at the ethical basis, it's a similar basis, but never mind, there's a question there. Now, let's now turn to a number of arguments. The first argument I'm going to call the argument for beneficence. Now, you may not have met this term at all or very often before. You're probably familiar with the phrase benevolence or the word benevolence. Benevolence literally means wishing well, from Latin volo, to wish, and bene, good or well. And beneficence comes from the Latin root bene facere, to do well or to do good. And so what we're really concerned with is aid as doing good to others. I mean, if it doesn't do good, it wouldn't be aid. So beneficence is the sort of the root idea of good action, action that does good for others. And that, of course, includes not just positive good, but responding to harms that may be caused by various factors, natural disasters, or by, indeed, the actions of others. So if we have beneficence as the doing good to others, as a fundamental idea, then we can ask the question, why do we want to do good? What lies behind the impulse to do good? Well, first of all, we might want to use words like kindness or charity or benevolence or humanitarian impulses. And the point about kindness and charity and benevolence and so on is that these can be understood at least as natural impulses, that we're naturally, as human beings, well disposed to some extent towards fellow human beings, and particularly when we see they're in trouble. And so kindness and charity and benevolence can be the names for, as it were, motives which are kind of our natural positive impulses. And as such, they aren't necessarily seen as moral duties. Now, of course, we do sometimes use the word kindness and charity and benevolence to refer to duties. We might say, oh, you have a duty to be kind, or you have a duty to be charitable, or a duty to be benevolent. But that's really a way of saying you have a duty to do good to others, because it's not so clear whether we can command our emotions in the same sort of way. But anyway, the point is that kindness and charity and benevolence can be the names of natural impulses, but they can be used to indicate the idea of a duty. So the question now is there a duty to be beneficent? That is, do we as human beings have duties to help one another anywhere in the world? Now, some people, as I'll say next time, think we only have duties to help people in our own country. I'm going to argue then against that limitation, that we have duties towards any human being as such. But anyway, the basic idea is the duty to be beneficent, to help others. What could be the basis of this? Well, there are all sorts of bases that we might want to pick and choose from in a way. I suppose the most fundamental idea that appeals to a lot of people is what we call the golden rule. The golden rule, I'm sure you're familiar with it in one form or another, is what philosophers would call the principle of reciprocity, which is do unto others what you would have done unto you. As some philosophers call this reciprocity, or the principle of universalizability. Can you universalize your principles of action? So you can universalize helping people because you want other people to help you. It's more difficult to universalize telling lies because you wouldn't want to have lies told to you, and so on. And the whole idea of universalizability is very much promoted by a German philosopher called Immanuel Kant, although many other philosophers would promote it in one form or another. And there's a reference to, if you want to pursue that, it's not easy philosophy, I have to admit to you. But anyway, there's a reference there. But let's not worry about Kant or philosophers. I'm sure you will all recognize that this principle, the golden rule, is one that's enshrined in the moral codes of all the major religions. a point that Hans Kung makes a lot of in his writings about what's common to all the religions. Anyway, so first of all, we have the old idea of the golden rule, simply doing unto others what you'd have done to yourself. Another idea which is quite favored by a number of thinkers is the whole idea of referring to human rights. There's a book by someone called Henry Shue, an American philosopher, that I've been much impressed with over the years. His book is called Basic Rights, Subsistence, Affluence, and U.S. Foreign Policy. Don't worry, most of the book is not about U.S. foreign policy. Most of it is a sort of general framework thinking about basic rights. And Shue very much promotes the argument, which I haven't time to go into in detail. I just want to give you the idea here that we do have a duty to promote the basic rights of one another. In fact, he treats basic rights as the minimum demand of all humanity on all humanity. I'll repeat that. The minimum demand of all humanity on all humanity. And he basically says we have basic rights of subsistence, security, and basic liberty. But his main point is that our duty is not just to avoid harming people or undermining their rights. We have a duty, one way or another, to promote the realization of these rights. And I think it's important to recognize that if we use the language of human rights, then we should recognize that human rights are not just about rights we are meant to avoid undermining or violating. They're about the claims people make on one another as human beings to try and promote the conditions in which their rights are realized. Anyway, I find the rights framework quite an attractive one for articulating why we should care about one another across the world. Okay, now another idea which I'll just throw out for you. As I say, these are all just ideas you might want to pursue, but you may feel no, that's not really for you to pursue, is the idea of playing one's part to promote a socially just society. Some of you may have heard of a well-known American philosopher called John Rawls, who wrote a very influential work called The Theory of Justice in 1971. And he basically argued that a socially just society is one in which everyone's interests are met to a reasonable level. He argues for a relatively equal society in which those who are least well off in society, the poor and so on, are as well off as they could be under any other social arrangement. So a very famous theory, which you might find intriguing. But anyway, his basic idea is that a reasonable society, a society that's socially just, is one in which everyone achieves a reasonable share of not only material wealth, but liberty and freedom and so on. And he argues that if we accept this idea of a socially just society, then we should play our part in promoting a socially just society by supporting it in one way or another. And this is interesting from the point of view of the world, when we think about world poverty, because various writers, including another of my philosophical heroes, Charles Bates, uses Rawls' theory at a global level. He says in his book Political Theory and International Relations, if you take Rawls' idea, then what we should be working for is a socially just world in which the if you like, resources of the world are so distributed that those in the world are least well off are as well off as they could be, which would be a heck of a lot more than they are in the real world as we know it now, because we know there's such extremes of inequality in the world as the world is now. So I just find that idea intriguing when I used to lecture on it before I retired, but I just mention it as an idea for you to play with if you want to. But I suppose that another well-known approach, one I'm personally less keen on for various reasons, but is nevertheless very popular, is a view called utilitarianism, which you've probably heard of. And utilitarianism is sometimes called the greatest happiness principle. It was first of all promoted by two 18th, 19th century philosophers called Bentham and John Stuart Mill. I give them the reference to Mill here. utilitarianism remains a very popular ethical theory because it basically says that the right thing to do is to promote the best balance of good outcomes over bad outcomes, which classically was interpreted as much happiness as little unhappiness, or as much pleasure as little pain as possible. And so utilitarians argued and still argue that it is our duty to promote the best balance of good over bad. And it's pretty obvious, if we take a candid view of good and bad, that since absolute poverty is extremely bad, that there's a kind of strong case for taking actions that will reduce extreme poverty on this utilitarian basis. So I've given you a kind of a number of different ways of thinking about why we might be concerned about world poverty. But now we turn to a rather sticky question. I don't know whether any of those answers have made any sense to you. Well, you might say, well, I prefer the golden rule, or I prefer the whole idea of rights, or whatever. But they all invite the question, a very crucial question, how much should we do this helping others? Granted, if we help others, we should help others not just at home, but in other parts of the world, in one way or another, by supporting charities and so on. The question is, how much should we do this? Now here, I want you to think about and respond to Peter Singer's famous principle. I say, if you've read it already, you'll know what's coming. If you haven't, then I invite you to ponder it. Because what Singer does is he sets up a challenge in the following very dramatic way. And I've used this article and his ideas on many classes over many years, and it always gets students going, whether they like it or don't like it. Because Singer says this: suppose you were a lecturer, or we think of a lecturer in a university campus, and he's walking to give his lecture, and there's a pond or a small lake in the middle of the university campus, and he sees that there's a child in the water struggling and possibly about to drown. What does the lecturer do? Well, what he would do, if he was at all normally human anyway, is he'd put down his stuff, jump in and rescue the child. I think we'd all do that. Now clearly there's some costs involved in his doing that. He gets his trousers and shoes wet and muddy, perhaps. He's late for his lecture, and so on. But we'd all recognize that those costs are as of nothing compared with the value of saving a human life, the child's life. And so Singer says, why do we all think the lecturer should do that, and why we would all do that? But he says, it's because there's the following principle involved. And it's this principle: if it's in our power to prevent something very bad from happening, without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought to do it. And Peter Singer thinks, yeah, surely that is what underlies our intuition that the lecturer ought to save the child. Now, we might say, well, is that the right intuition? But let's just work with it for the moment. That's the intuition that Peter Singer has and recommends to us. But he says, if we accept that principle, the principle that I've just enunciated, then it has dramatic consequences. Because if you think of anyone who's at all well off in richer countries, and indeed anyone who's at all well off in a poor country as well, although he's thinking mainly of the rich countries, this was written in 1972, sorry, clearly there's an awful lot that we could do in terms of writing checks to charities and doing various things, joining organizations, but he's mainly concerned with our willingness to part with a significant amount of our wealth, which would enable, through appropriate charities, to enable a lot of poorer people to survive, do better, but certainly many of them would die otherwise but for our efforts. And so he thinks, since saving lives is so important, these things ought to take priority over many of the normal things we do in our ordinary lives. Now, he's not saying, I should point out, and you'll see that it comes out in the article, he's not saying that therefore we should stop looking after our children and so on and so forth. Clearly, we do have other significant duties. This is what he called comparable moral importance. We have duties to our children, relatives and family, and indeed to friends. We have other kinds of duties which are important. But when we quite honestly consider all the duties that we think are important to us, we reckon what we need to discharge those duties, we could all do an awful lot more by way of particularly passing on with our money to enable poor people to be helped. And I suppose the key challenge is, for instance, how much time and energy we put into our own leisure activities, going on expensive holidays, skiing trips, or buying ourselves expensive clothes, or even getting expensive presents for our children when our children don't really need those expensive presents. They've got a lot of good presents and toys already and so on. So it's a challenge. It's a really very big challenge to us. He intended it to be a big challenge. He says, if you accept this, it'll make a radical change to your lives. And it means our lives might not be quite recognizable as we know them now. And I think it is a really big challenge because, to me, if we take the principle seriously, it's not just about money. It's about using our spare time and energy and efforts and skills in all sorts of ways. So I think Singer's principle is an important one. It gets us to think. I don't think myself that we should take it as absolutely correct, but I think it provides us with a challenge and makes us realize that we really should consider seriously just how much we're willing to do to help others, including, of course, actions that might help world poverty. Okay, well, I've given you a taste for the kind of positive arguments for beneficence. I now want to look more briefly at a couple of related arguments which have a rather different aspect to them. And I've called this, again rather heavy-handedly I suppose, non-maleficence and corrective justice. Now, non-maleficence, you can probably guess from what I've said about beneficence, is the principle of not doing harm to other people. And corrective justice is about the idea of compensating for harms already done. Now, let me just give you an example of this. You may think it's not terribly relevant, because you might think that what you do, particularly if you live in a rich country and not in a poor country yourself, you might say, well, how can this affect me? I don't directly harm people at all. But we have to consider the possibility that we might be involved in some way in harming people, and we should stop it. I expect you've all heard of fair trade. I put the symbol up here. And I know it's more popular in some countries than others, but it's catching on all over the world. It's big business in some ways. But the whole idea of fair trade is that the goods we get that have the fair trade label have come through economic relationships and markets and so on, whereby the poor farmers at the other end have a much more sustainable basis for producing their goods and get a reasonable price at a consistent level for those goods. And this helps poor farmers considerably compared with often the highly erratic conditions under which they try and sell their produce to companies and so on and so forth. But the point I want to make to you is this: if you engage in fair trade, I don't know how many of you do this a little bit, but if one engages in fair trade, the question immediately asks, the question one must immediately ask is, why engage in it? Well, one way of looking at this, which seems natural to me, is that if one buys fair trade goods as opposed to unfair trade goods, or goods that just come through the normal free trade system, one's trying to reduce one's dependency on patterns of trade that are either unfair or less fair. So by the very fact that one opts for fair trade option means that implicitly, even if one hasn't thought about it very much, one has a sense that an awful lot of what one buys in the way of food and indeed many other things somehow comes through economic systems that are not entirely fair or helpful to the very poor at the other end of the chain of goods and so on. So I invite you to consider whether or not you currently engage in fair trade, to see how, if one did want to engage in fair trade, it's because there's an implicit recognition that other goods not fairly traded somehow are less fairly traded, and therefore one's trying to reduce one's dependence on such things. And this links into a whole big issue about global justice. There's a great big literature on global justice, and one of the key figures in this is someone called Thomas Pogge, who's not only wrote an influential book, World Poverty and Human Rights, but also edited, I think, more than one book on global justice issues. But the issue of global justice that's often raised, there are many other issues to do with global justice, but a common way of framing the issue of global justice is this: do international systems, political and economic, work in such a way that the rights of poor people are properly respected? And many people would argue, including Thomas Pogge, and I have some sympathy for this, would argue not really. That in many ways the international system is not well geared to enabling very poor people to escape from their extreme poverty. It often reinforces it because of the terms of trade, because of the way companies operate in poor countries, particularly international companies, and so on and so forth. And so there's a whole kind of issue here, which I'm just touching the tip of, as to the nature of international economic and political relationships. And so if one has any sense that the way the international system works is not entirely helpful to the prospects of the poor, then one has reason to want to change it. And one small symbolic gesture in that, of course, is engaging in fair trade. Another thing is to campaign about it, to put pressure on your government to try and change what they do in international trade, to put pressure on companies, and so on and so forth. There's all sorts of things you can do beyond your own personal choice of what you buy. Anyway, there is this big challenge, and I just mentioned here the point that if we don't confront this big issue, then there is a real danger that we give aid with one hand, trying to do good, but on the other hand, we're involved in or support a global economic system that has the opposite effects. And somehow there's a kind of inconsistency there if we're not prepared to recognize it. In addition to the idea of reducing one's dependence on practices that harm or undermine rights, there's also another kind of argument, which is linked to it. One may also accept the need to compensate for practices in the past and present that have done these things up till now. And as I suppose you're all well aware, that it is often said that if you look at the colonial era, sometimes called the imperialist era, that countries in Europe that dominated and controlled many other parts of the world did it in such a way that they benefited much more than the people in those countries did themselves, and in a way that's now judged to be unfair and oppressive. But it is also argued, and this links with Thomas Pogge's point, that even in the post-colonial period, the whole way the international economic system has not helped very poor countries, and particularly hasn't helped very poor people within them. So, if one accepts that there is this kind of record, and one has benefited from it by being one of the better off members of one's own society, then one may feel there ought to be some kind of action to compensate for these past practices. So that gives one an additional reason for wanting to support serious aid programs and international reform of trade and so on to achieve this. And incidentally, I think Haiti is a case in point. I haven't studied Haiti history particularly. I expect some of you are preparing for this rather better than I have. But it does seem to me that it can be argued that Haiti was a rather good case for a country that was under colonial control and wasn't exactly helped as much as it might have been in the colonial period. And Haiti has not been a country that's benefited particularly from the international economic system ever since. Of course, there are many other reasons why Haiti's present situation is not very good. Certainly the internal political order hasn't been exactly helpful either. And of course, then you have a major earthquake, and that puts things further back. But no doubt that you'll be thinking about Haiti quite a bit as you prepare for and work in it. Now, the point about these arguments where we need to compensate for past practices or practices up till now that we recognize are not entirely satisfactory, these arguments for aid are sometimes called backward-looking arguments, whereas beneficence, doing good, as such, is forward-looking. Let me explain that. Beneficence is forward-looking because it simply says, here's something we can do to help, and we'll do it. It's a positive, forward-looking into the future response to a situation. And a bit like the lecturer passing the pond, there's no suggestion the lecturer pushed the child into the pond or was responsible for the child being in the pond, but the lecturer recognizes there's a good he can do, namely saving the child. That's forward-looking. But these arguments say that the things we ought to do now because of what has happened, which we're trying to rectify. And incidentally, there's a similar argument now that's used about climate change, that because industrialized countries have contributed towards climate change, there's also an additional reason for us to take serious actions to change our ways and to compensate and so on. And incidentally, the difference between backward-looking and forward-looking arguments is well illustrated in the case of keeping a promise. Some people argue we should keep a promise because sorry, I mixed up something here. I was thinking of the case of punishment. It shouldn't be a promise here. In the case of a promise, we might say the importance of promise keeping is that if we keep promises, then that will make people continue to be confident about future undertakings by people. And other people say the reason why you should keep a promise is nothing to do with the future. It's the fact that you've made a promise. And similarly, with regard to punishment, some people argue the reason why we ought to punish people is to deter other people in the future from doing bad things, and other people argue that the reason for punishing is a backward-looking reason because they deserve it. Anyway, that's just to illustrate the difference. Now, very quickly, at the end, this presentation is probably a bit longer than the other two will be, but it gets us into the issues. Let me just very quickly say something about the arguments concerning states. So far, I've been trying to give you some sense of the range of the kinds of arguments that might be given for helping with development, or helping alleviate extreme poverty anyway. And it's various positive arguments and this later argument to do with non-maleficence and compensation. But if we ask whether states should give aid, particularly well-off states, should give aid to help other states that are much poorer and where there's a lot of extreme poverty, the arguments are rather more complicated. And the reason why they're more complicated is because, after all, the governments of states have certain kind of relationships of an ethical kind, arguably. They don't often observe them, but they have ethical relations with their own citizens. Governments have duties towards their own citizens. They also have obligations towards other states as a result of living in an international community of states, society of states. So I would argue very, very quickly here, there are three kinds of argument. The first kind of argument is the range of arguments that have applied to individuals. So we might say, well, the states ought to compensate for past wrongs just as individuals, insofar as they've been involved in them, should do so. We might say states ought positively to do good for the reasons I've given and so on. But as I said, it gets more complicated because of states' particular position. There is an additional reason why I think states, particularly richer states, should give aid, and that's because they've entered into international agreements. And there's a principle in international relations called pacta sunt servanda, it's a Latin phrase meaning agreements should be kept, that says basically that if states have given an undertaking to do things, then they have an obligation to honor those undertakings, just as we would say that about a promise by an individual. So there are international agreements, and as some of you, or maybe all of you know, that in the 1970s, the richer countries in the world gave a commitment they would give 0.7% of GNP in foreign aid. Most countries don't actually give that amount, and some are much more behind than others. But still, there was a commitment made, and that is an additional reason why states should do so. And similarly, in year 2000, the Millennium Development Goals were agreed in the UN, and this also renewed the commitments that rich countries should take all sorts of measures to try and help achieve those Millennium Development Goals. So, you know, there's obviously a framework in which the ethical imperative to give aid is embedded in international relations itself. Now, some of us might argue the richer countries should do a lot more, and that actually aid is not the main issue. The main issue is reforming the whole way the international economic system works, which is what I would want to argue as well. But still, here it is, an international agreement, which we should recognize. The other factor which has to be mentioned finally is the democratic mandate argument, that basically the reason why governments should give aid is partly because electorates have, as it were, signaled in one way or another that they want their governments to give aid. So that over the years, in a country like Britain, there is a general consensus amongst most electorates that Britain, being a rich country, ought to give a certain amount of aid to help with poor countries' development and particularly poverty alleviation. And because the electorates have given that kind of indication one way or another, then governments have a duty to give aid. But of course the flip side of that is that governments only have a duty to give so much aid, because if governments suddenly decided that they wanted to give a lot more aid, they might find the public, whom they have to serve, saying, hey, wait a sec, we haven't authorized or mandated the giving of more than a certain amount of aid. And personally, I mean, I would like our government to give more aid than most people probably would think they should give. But we have to acknowledge that there is this internal dynamic connected with the whole nature of political philosophy, which also shapes what countries do about aid. Okay, well, I've thrown a lot at you in this presentation, but I hope you've got a sense of the sort of framework for thinking about the ethics of giving aid. And next slide, you'll see that I've given you 3 questions which you might want to consider privately, and then in the seminar I think it's going to be set up on the web. But I'm not restricting you to these 3 questions. Obviously any other issues that come up from what I've said, I hope you will discuss in the seminar or the forum. But just to quickly tell you the 3 questions that occurred to me in preparing this presentation. First of all, do you respond to calls to support emergency assistance in a different way from calls to support development assistance? That issue I raised at the beginning. If you treat them differently, why? If not, why not? I think it's worth just exploring how one responds to different kinds of situation in the world. Secondly, I'd like you to ponder the Singer article. I've only given you the main argument of the Singer article. He's obviously got various supplementary arguments, replies to objections and so on. Do have a look at the arguments and have a bit of a discussion on the forum. If Singer's argument is too strong, why is it too strong? I think it is a bit too strong, but it's interesting to ask oneself, well, why do we not accept it in its strong form? Or perhaps some of you will say, yes, I want to defend it. But I think the crucial question with Singer's challenge is, what are we going to regard as of morally comparable importance? That's where a lot of the debate has been about, I mean, how significant are the pursuit of my own projects and interests and hobbies? Are they morally important or not? And you might like to consider that question. And the related question, how much of a radical transformation of our lives would be involved if we did follow Singer's principle? And finally, I've hinted on this with one or two examples. Is it problematic to consider the ethics of aid in isolation from considering the whole way the global economy works? Most people tend to think of it in isolation, but I've suggested that maybe we should think of aid as only part of a total picture in which ethical issues are raised about how we economically relate to other parts of the world. So that's it, folks, for the first presentation. I'll be with you again with the second fairly soon.